What would you do if life offered you an unexpected second chance? For Jack Sullivan, that moment came on a rainy Tuesday at a forgotten roadside diner, and his response would not only change his life but heal wounds in a community that had been festering for 30 years. The rain fell in sheets across the cracked asphalt of Old Route 66, drumming against the roof of Jack Sullivan's Cadillac as he peered through the windshield wipers, struggling to keep pace. He hadn't planned to stop in Cooper's Creek. In fact, he'd spent the last 3 decades deliberately avoiding this dot on the map where he'd grown up, where he'd made the mistake that had defined his life. But the storm had other plans. As did the engine light glowing amber on his dashboard. "Perfect," Jack muttered, easing the car onto the shoulder. At 67, he'd achieved everything he'd set out to accomplish after leaving this town: financial success as a real estate developer, a reputation as a tough but fair businessman, and a comfortable retirement that allowed him to travel the country in style. What he hadn't counted on was his luxury car breaking down precisely 3 miles from the town limits of the place he'd sworn never to return to. Through the rain-streaked window, Jack spotted a faded neon sign flickering in the distance: Emma's Diner, home cooking since 1955. A relic from another era, somehow still standing while most of the old Route 66 establishments had long since been abandoned. With a resigned sigh, Jack grabbed his phone to call roadside assistance, only to find no service bars. Another sign that technology, like progress itself, had largely bypassed Cooper's Creek. He'd have to find a landline, something he hadn't used in what felt like a lifetime. Pulling his coat over his head, Jack made a dash through the downpour to the diner's entrance. A bell jingled overhead as he pushed open the door, the sound as familiar as a half-remembered dream. Inside, Emma's Diner was like a time capsule. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, their edges cracked with age but meticulously taped. The black and white checkered floor had been worn to gray in places from decades of footsteps. Behind the counter, a pie case displayed 3 varieties, their handwritten signs promising "homemade daily." The place was empty save for an elderly waitress arranging silverware and a cook visible through the pass-through window, his white hair bright against his dark skin as he hunched over the grill. "Be right with you, Han," the waitress called without looking up. "Sit anywhere you like." Jack chose a booth near the back, shaking rainwater from his coat. He'd just settled in when the waitress approached, order pad in hand. She wore a pale blue uniform that might have been fashionable when Eisenhower was president, her white hair pulled back in a neat bun, deep lines etched around eyes that had seen their share of life. "What can I get for you?" she asked, then stopped, her pencil hovering over the pad as she studied his face. "My goodness. Jack. Jack Sullivan." Jack felt a jolt of recognition mixed with dread. "Dorothy. Dorothy Miller." The woman's weathered face broke into a smile. "It's Dorothy Williams now, though that marriage didn't last as long as the name did." She slipped into the seat across from him. "I haven't seen you since, well, since before you left town." The careful way she phrased it wasn't lost on Jack. "Before you left town. Not after the accident. Not after what happened to the Thompson boy. Just before you left." "I didn't plan to stop," Jack said, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Car trouble. I just need to use a phone." Dorothy nodded, her eyes never leaving his face, as if she were cataloging the changes 30 years had wrought. "Phones in the back office. But the storms knocked out the landlines. Radio says it'll pass in an hour or so." She gestured to the window where rain continued to lash against the glass. "Why don't you have some coffee while you wait? Maybe a slice of pie? Charlie still makes the best apple pie in 3 counties." At the mention of the cook's name, Jack stiffened. "Charlie Thompson is cooking here." Dorothy's expression softened. "Going on 20 years now. Took over when Emma retired." Jack felt the walls of the small diner closing in. Charlie Thompson. The father of Michael Thompson, the 17-year-old boy who had been in the passenger seat of Jack's car that night 30 years ago. The night Jack had been driving too fast on a rain-slicked road, showing off his new car. The night that had ended with twisted metal and a funeral Jack had been too much of a coward to attend. "I should go," Jack said, already reaching for his coat. "In this weather? Don't be ridiculous." Dorothy's hand covered his, surprisingly strong for her age. "Charlie's a different man than he was back then. We all are." Before Jack could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Charlie Thompson emerged, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He was thinner than Jack remembered, his once powerful frame now slightly stooped, but his eyes were the same, dark and penetrating, taking in everything. Those eyes found Jack's, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. Then Charlie gave a small nod, as if confirming something to himself. "Thought I recognized that voice," he said, his own voice deeper than Jack recalled. "Been a long time, Jack." Jack couldn't read the emotion in Charlie's tone, not anger, not welcome, something more complex. Charlie held up a hand. "Your coffee's getting cold, Dorothy," he said, turning back toward the kitchen. "And I've got biscuits in the oven." As the door swung shut behind him, Jack released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "He hates me," he said quietly. "Can't say I blame him." Dorothy poured coffee into a mug and slid it across the table. "Charlie doesn't hate anyone. Not anymore." She settled back into the booth. "That doesn't mean he's forgotten. None of us have. But 30 years is a long time to carry hate, Jack. It gets heavy." Jack stared into his coffee, the bitter aroma rising with the steam. "Some things you don't get to put down, Dorothy. Some debts can't be repaid." "Maybe," she conceded. "But you don't know until you try." For the next hour, as the storm raged outside, Dorothy filled Jack in on the town he'd left behind. How the textile mill had closed in '95, taking half the jobs with it. How the interstate bypass had diverted traffic from Route 66, leaving businesses like Emma's Diner struggling to survive. How his own parents had passed within a year of each other, his father never mentioning Jack's name again after he'd left town, his mother sending birthday cards to his attorney's address until her final year. "She never stopped hoping you'd come home," Dorothy said gently. Jack nodded, a knot forming in his throat. "And the Thompsons?" "After Michael." "Hard years," Dorothy acknowledged. "Charlie's wife, Evelyn, she took it the hardest. Never really recovered. Passed in '98, cancer, they said, but some of us think it was grief. Charlie raised their daughter alone. Became a different man, quieter, more inward. Started cooking at the church suppers, found he had a talent for it. When Emma wanted to retire but couldn't find a buyer for the diner, Charlie stepped in." Jack glanced toward the kitchen. "And he's kept it going all this time. It's not just a diner to him," Dorothy explained. "It's, well, you'll see." Before Jack could ask what she meant, the bell above the door jingled again. A group of teenagers burst in, shaking off rain, their laughter filling the quiet space. "Hey, Miss Dorothy," called a girl with bright blue hair. "Is Mr. Charlie making those potato things today?" "Rosemary potatoes are on special," Dorothy confirmed, standing up. "Take your usual booth, I'll be right there." As the teens settled in, more customers arrived, an elderly couple helping each other through the door, a woman in nurse's scrubs clearly just finishing a shift, two men in work uniforms spattered with paint. Within minutes, the empty diner had transformed into a bustling community hub. Jack watched in amazement as Dorothy greeted each person by name, asking about family members, health concerns, job situations. It wasn't just service, it was genuine connection. From the kitchen, Charlie emerged carrying trays of food, not fast food, but carefully prepared plates that he delivered himself, pausing to chat with each table. When he reached the teenagers, he placed an extra basket of biscuits in the center of their table. "Study session running late today?" he asked the blue-haired girl. "Chemistry test tomorrow," she confirmed. Ms. Harrington's a killer. Charlie smiled, the first smile Jack had seen on his face. Your mother struggled with chemistry too. But she got through it. So will you. The girl beamed at him. Thanks, Grandpa. Jack felt the floor shift beneath him. Grandpa. The blue-haired girl was Michael's daughter. Charlie's granddaughter. A living reminder of what had been lost that night. As if sensing his thoughts, Charlie's eyes met Jack's across the room. This time, there was a clear invitation in his gaze. He tilted his head toward the kitchen door before disappearing back through it. Jack hesitated, then stood, making his way past the filled tables to the swinging door. Behind it, the kitchen was immaculate, stainless steel surfaces gleaming, pots simmering on the industrial stove, the air rich with the scent of baking bread and something savory that made Jack's stomach rumble despite his anxiety. Charlie stood at a workstation, rolling out dough with practiced movements. He didn't look up as Jack entered, but he spoke, his voice matter of fact. Every Tuesday and Thursday, we feed those kids for free. After-school program. Some of them don't get much at home. His hands never stopped moving as he talked. Mondays are for the seniors, half-price lunch special. Wednesdays, the nurses from the clinic get free coffee and pie. They work long hours for not enough pay. Jack watched him work, unsure how to respond. You've built something important here. Charlie nodded, finally looking up. When Michael died, I wanted to die too. Spent 5 years drinking myself toward that goal. Nearly made it. His eyes held Jack's, unflinching. Then one morning, I woke up and realized I was still here. He wasn't coming back, but I was still here. Had to figure out what that meant. He gestured around the kitchen. This is what it meant. Feeding people. Creating a place where folks can come together, where nobody goes hungry, where the kids have somewhere safe to be after school. A small, sad smile crossed his face. Michael always wanted to open a restaurant someday. Said he'd name it after me. Jack felt the weight of 30 years pressing down on him, the guilt, the shame, the knowledge that he'd run away while Charlie had stayed and built something meaningful from his grief. I'm sorry, Jack said, the words so inadequate they almost choked him. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am so deeply sorry, Charlie. Not a day goes by that I don't think about Michael, about what I took from him. From you. Charlie was quiet for a long moment, his hands still working the dough. You know what the hardest part was, he finally said. Not that he died. That was unbearable, but it was an accident. You didn't set out to hurt him. He looked up, his eyes damp. The hardest part was that you disappeared. No word, no explanation. Just gone. Like Michael's life meant so little you couldn't even face us. The truth of it hit Jack like a physical blow. I was a coward, he admitted. I told myself I was sparing you from having to see me, but really, I was sparing myself. I couldn't face what I'd done. Charlie nodded, as if this confirmation settled something for him. Well, you're facing it now. 30 years late, but here you are. Here I am, Jack echoed. Though I didn't exactly plan it this way. Few things in life go according to plan, Charlie said, a hint of wry humor in his voice. Otherwise I wouldn't be a 68-year-old line cook in a diner that barely breaks even most months. Jack looked around the kitchen with new eyes, noting the commercial-grade appliances that had seen better days, the patched linoleum floor, the ceiling tile stained from an old leak. Is the diner in trouble? Charlie shrugged, returning to his dough. Property taxes went up again this year. And the building needs a new roof before winter. We'll manage. We always do. Before Jack could respond, Dorothy pushed through the door, order pad in hand. Charlie, I need 2 specials, a BLT, and 3 sides of those potatoes that Lily loves so much. Coming right up, Charlie said, moving to the grill with practiced efficiency. Dorothy turned to Jack. Storms letting up. Radio says the roads should be clear soon. It was a gentle reminder that he could leave now, continue his journey, put Cooper's Creek behind him once more. Jack nodded, but found himself reluctant to step back through the door into the diner, to walk away from this unexpected reconnection. "Dorothy," he said instead, "tell me more about the diner. About what Charlie's built here." Over the next hour, as Charlie cooked and Dorothy served, Jack learned the full story of Emma's Diner and its place in the struggling community of Cooper's Creek. How it had become more than just a restaurant, it was a gathering place, a support system, sometimes the only reliable meal for children from homes where addiction or poverty had taken root. "The mill closing hit us hard," Dorothy explained during a quiet moment. "Then the opioid crisis came. We've lost a lot of good people, seen a lot of families torn apart. The diner's one of the few constants left." By the time the last customer had left and Dorothy had flipped the sign to "closed," Jack had made a decision. He waited until Charlie emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, looking tired but satisfied after the day's work. "I'd like to help," Jack said simply. Charlie's eyebrows rose. "Help? With the diner? The roof? Whatever else is needed." Jack took a deep breath. "I can't bring Michael back. I can't undo what happened. But I can do this." Charlie studied him for a long moment. "We're not a charity case, Jack." "I know that," Jack said quickly. "This isn't about charity. It's about making amends, I guess. About finally doing something right in this town." Dorothy, who had been pretending not to listen as she wiped down tables, abandoned the pretense. "Lord knows we could use the help, Charlie. That roof won't fix itself." Charlie sighed, looking between them. "I need to think about it. This place, what we do here, it's not just business. It's Michael's legacy." Jack nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'll be at the Pinewood Motel tonight, if the roads are clear enough to get there." "Pinewood closed years ago," Dorothy informed him. "Nearest motel's in Fairview, 20 miles east." "Oh." Jack hadn't considered this complication. "Well, I guess I'll head that way then." Charlie and Dorothy exchanged a look, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Charlie spoke. "My house has a spare room. Used to be Michael's. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean." The offer hung in the air between them, its significance not lost on Jack. To stay in Michael's room, in Charlie's house, it was more than just a place to sleep. It was an opening, a chance at the redemption he'd never allowed himself to seek. "I'd be honored," Jack said quietly. "Thank you." That night, in the small bedroom with its faded posters of 90s rock bands and high school sports pennants preserved like a memorial, Jack lay awake thinking about paths not taken and the strange twists of fate that had brought him back to Cooper's Creek. Outside, the rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the eaves, a gentle rhythm that reminded him of childhood nights in this same small town. In the morning, Jack made a series of phone calls, to his roadside assistance service, to his assistant back in Chicago, to his attorney. By the time he joined Charlie for coffee in the kitchen, Dorothy had already left to open the diner. He had a proposal ready. "I'd like to establish a foundation," Jack explained. "The Michael Thompson Community Fund. Initial endowment of $2 million, with the diner as its first project." Charlie nearly choked on his coffee. $2 million. "It's not as much as it sounds," Jack said. "The interest will generate enough for annual projects, building repairs, scholarship programs, community services. The principal stays untouched so it continues in perpetuity." Charlie set down his mug carefully. "Why would you do this?" "Because I can," Jack said simply. "Because it's 30 years overdue." "Because..." He hesitated, then continued, "Because I think it's what Michael would have wanted. For his hometown to thrive. For his father to have security. For his legacy to be more than just tragedy. Charlie was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee as if it held answers. Finally, he looked up. "There's something I need to show you first," he said. "Before I give you an answer." After breakfast, Charlie drove them in his old pickup truck to the town cemetery, a peaceful plot of land on a gentle hill overlooking Cooper's Creek. They walked in silence past weathered headstones until they reached a simple marble marker under a maple tree. Michael James Thompson, 1975–1992. Beloved son, brother, friend. His light shines on. Jack stood before the grave, emotions he'd suppressed for decades finally breaking through. Tears slid down his face as he knelt to touch the cool stone. "I should have been here," he whispered. "I should have faced this with you, Charlie. I'm so sorry." Charlie placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, not in comfort exactly, but in acknowledgement. "I come here every Sunday," he said. "Tell him about the diner, about Lily, that's his sister's girl, the one with the blue hair. About the town. I like to think he hears me." Jack nodded, unable to speak. "For years, I told him about my anger too," Charlie continued. "How I couldn't forgive you. How the hole you left was almost as big as the one he left." He sighed deeply. "But anger's a poor companion for grief, Jack. Eventually, I had to let it go, or it would have consumed whatever was left of me." He knelt beside Jack, his own hand reaching out to touch his son's name carved in stone. "I think Michael would approve of your foundation idea. He always wanted to make things better for people. Got that from his mother." They stayed a while longer, Charlie sharing stories about Michael that Jack had never known, how he'd taught himself guitar, how he'd volunteered at the elementary school reading program, how he'd dreamed of traveling to Italy someday to learn authentic cooking. As they walked back to the truck, Charlie said, "There's one condition to my accepting your help." "Name it," Jack replied. "You have to stay. Not forever, but long enough to see it through. No more running away." Jack felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the knot he'd carried for 30 years. "I'm done running, Charlie. I promise you that." A new chapter begins over the next 6 months. Cooper's Creek witnessed a transformation that few could have imagined. The Michael Thompson Community Fund became official, with a board comprising Charlie, Dorothy, and other longtime residents who understood the town's needs. Emma's Diner received not just a new roof, but a complete renovation that preserved its vintage charm while updating the infrastructure. The kitchen was equipped with modern appliances that made Charlie laugh with delight the first time he fired up the new range. Solar panels on the roof reduced energy costs, and a small greenhouse behind the building allowed for year-round herbs and vegetables. But the changes went beyond the diner. The fund established a scholarship program for local students, prioritizing those interested in culinary arts or community service. It partnered with the regional medical center to bring a satellite clinic to town, providing healthcare access that had been sorely lacking. It funded repairs to the community center, creating space for addiction recovery meetings, job training programs, and after-school activities. And through it all, Jack Sullivan stayed, living in a small apartment above the hardware store, rolling up his sleeves alongside volunteers, using his business connections to secure grants and partnerships that multiplied the fund's impact. He became a regular at the diner, sometimes helping in the kitchen, sometimes simply sitting at the counter watching Charlie work his magic, the two men building a friendship that neither could have imagined possible. "You know," Charlie said one evening as they closed up, "Michael would have liked the man you've become." Jack looked up, surprised. "You think so?" Charlie nodded, his expression thoughtful. "He was always good at seeing the best in people. Even when they couldn't see it themselves." On the 1-year anniversary of Jack's return to Cooper's Creek, a special dinner was held at the diner. The place was packed, not just with regular customers, but with people whose lives had been touched by the fund's work. The blue-haired Lily, now a freshman at the State University thanks to a Michael Thompson scholarship, gave a speech that left few dry eyes in the room. "My Uncle Michael died before I was born," she said, her voice strong despite her emotion. "But his spirit has always been part of this town, part of our family. Now, thanks to the foundation that bears his name, his legacy will live on in tangible ways, in opportunities for students like me, in healthcare for our neighbors, in this beautiful diner where my grandfather creates not just meals, but community." She turned to where Jack and Charlie stood side by side near the kitchen door. "And in the remarkable friendship between two men who found a way to transform tragedy into hope." Later, as the celebration wound down, Jack and Charlie sat at a corner booth, cups of coffee between them. "I've been thinking," Jack said, turning his mug in his hands. "About staying. Permanently." Charlie raised an eyebrow. "What about your life in Chicago? Your business?" Jack shrugged. "I'm retired, remember? And I've discovered I prefer small-town living more than I expected." He hesitated, then added, "There's more healing to be done here. More work. I'd like to see it through." Charlie nodded slowly. "The old Jenkins property by the river is for sale. Good bones, need some work. Might suit you." It was as close to a blessing as Charlie would give, but it was enough. Jack smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't known in 30 years. "I might just look into that," he said. Outside the diner window, Cooper's Creek was coming alive with spring, new leaves on the old trees, flowers pushing through soil that had seemed dormant but never truly was. A fitting metaphor, Jack thought, for what had happened here. For what had happened within him. A personal reflection on redemption and second chances. As I reflect on Jack and Charlie's story, I'm struck by how often life offers us crossroads we don't expect, moments where a breakdown, a wrong turn, or a storm can lead us precisely where we need to be, even if it's the last place we'd choose to go. Jack Sullivan spent 30 years running from his past, building a successful life by most external measures, yet carrying a wound that never healed. It took an unexpected return to Cooper's Creek, the very place of his greatest shame, for him to find the redemption he never believed possible. Charlie Thompson, too, faced a crossroads after unimaginable loss. He could have remained consumed by grief and anger, or he could transform that pain into purpose. In choosing to honor his son through service to others, he created a legacy far more powerful than bitterness could ever be. Their story reminds me that it's never too late for a second chance. Never too late to face the past we've been avoiding. Never too late to transform regret into redemption. I think about the roads not taken in my own life, the apologies never offered, the amends never made, the relationships that ended with unfinished business. I wonder how many of us are carrying burdens similar to Jack's, believing some mistakes are too big to be forgiven, some bridges permanently burned. What if we're wrong? What if, like Jack, we found the courage to return to those difficult places, literally or figuratively, and face what we've been running from? What if, like Charlie, we discovered that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, but about refusing to let it determine the future? The most powerful moment in this story, for me, isn't the grand gesture of the foundation or even the community's transformation. It's that quiet moment at Michael's grave, where two broken men kneel side by side, finally sharing the grief that had separated them for decades. It's Charlie's hand on Jack's shoulder, not in comfort, but in acknowledgement. It's the beginning of healing that neither man thought possible. Your turn to consider second chances. This story challenges me, and I hope it challenges you, to consider where redemption might be waiting in your own life. What relationship needs healing? What apology remains unspoken? What community might benefit from your return, your reinvestment, your reconciliation? Here's my invitation to you, this week, identify one unresolved situation from your past that still weighs on your heart. It might be a relationship that ended poorly, a community you left behind, or a mistake you've never fully addressed. Then take one small step toward reconciliation. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as Jack's return to Cooper's Creek. It might be a phone call, a letter, or simply a conversation with someone who can help you process what happened and consider possible next steps. Remember that redemption rarely happens in a single grand gesture. For Jack and Charlie, it began with a rainstorm and a cup of coffee, then unfolded over months of small, consistent actions that gradually rebuilt trust and created something new from the ashes of tragedy. If the person you've harmed isn't ready to reconcile, or isn't able to, perhaps because they've passed away, consider how you might honor them through service to others, as Charlie did for Michael through the diner. Sometimes, the most meaningful amends we can make are indirect, channeling our regret into positive action that benefits a cause or community the person valued. And if you're in Charlie's position, carrying the weight of an old hurt, wondering if forgiveness is possible or even desirable, consider the freedom he found in releasing his anger. Not for Jack's sake initially, but for his own. For his granddaughter. For the community that needed what he had to offer. As Charlie discovered, forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It doesn't minimize the loss or excuse the wrong. But it does create space for something new to grow, something that honors what was lost while refusing to be defined by it. If this story has touched something in you, I encourage you to share it with someone who might need its message of hope and redemption. Perhaps there's someone in your life who, like Jack, needs to know that it's never too late to make amends. Or someone like Charlie, who needs permission to release the burden of anger they've carried for too long. Because ultimately, this isn't just a story about two men in a small town on Route 66. It's about all of us, our capacity for both terrible mistakes and remarkable healing, our fear of facing the past and our hunger for second chances, our power to transform even our deepest regrets into sources of hope and renewal. In a world that often feels increasingly divided and unforgiving, Jack and Charlie's journey reminds us that reconciliation is possible, that broken relationships can be mended, that communities can be renewed, not by forgetting the past, but by facing it together with courage, honesty, and a willingness to begin again. What second chance might be waiting for you, just around the next unexpected bend in the road?